Hello, Haiku here for the Wilds of Eldraine common slash historic popper and explorer popper set review. So I'm going to be going over all of the commons in each of the colors and kind of going through their relevance for the historic popper and the explorer popper meta. So there is some overlap with Paper Pauper and those cards, but again, given that that card pool is much more deep, some of the cards that I'll be talking about aren't quite relevant for the Paper Pauper, that much larger pool. But I want to just give my overall impressions of the set. I think this was is a very strong set. I think it was kind of expected because bargain. So the two things that we had heard spoiled before was that it was going to be enchantment based, and it was going to have adventures again. And so both of those mechanics are pretty strong in Pauper. Adventures being basically inherent in 2-for-1, has a lot of depth in Pauper and a lot of utility in Pauper. And then once we heard that it was enchantment theme, enchantments are a subtype that's pretty strong in the Pauper meta. And then we later heard that that we got bargain, and I think bargain is a standout mechanic that is going to be very, very strong in historic and explorer Pauper decks. All right. And let's get started on the white cards. So, Archon's Glory, a 1 mana instant trick, just +2/+2, but then you get a little bonus if you bargain. I don't think this is really there for constructed. Armory Mice, a 2 mana 3/1 that gets a little bit of a bonus if you trigger Celebration, which white is a color that can trigger Celebration easily. I mean, Throbbing Inspector is a really widely played card, so triggering it pretty easily to get a 3/3 is pretty easy, but a 3/3 is a 3/3. It's not that good. And the biggest issue holding this card back is that the 1 toughness on your opponent's turn when they're likely to be able to wrath it. I like that we're getting some more low to the ground aggressive cards. I don't think this is quite where you want to be for an aggressive deck. Besotted Knight, this is going to be a really good card. So Besotted Knight is one of the adventure cards. The adventure is a 1 mana sorcery that creates a royal roll token attached to target creature. And so this is the first time we get the roll card. So we got all of the different rolls, the 6 rolls at common, which was surprising. And so Royal Roll is one of the better ones. I think the only other one was Young Hero is probably better for Pauper. But giving Ward is really clutch. So I see this going in. It's more for this part of the card. The adventure part of the card is the strength of this card. So I see it going into white and green-white decks that are playing Ethereal Armor, because again, this counts for your enchantment counts, and that aren't playing hexproof. They're playing more based on low creatures and protecting it with Karamicha's Blessing and other. So the ward will also help. So I don't think this obviously doesn't. It's a redundant ability against if you're playing with hexproof creatures, but if you're playing with since our first hexproof creature is a blue card that starts at 2 mana, and then the rest of them are 3 mana or above. Some of the decks can speed up by just avoiding playing hexproof and just playing creatures that you're just trying to grow and protect. So it's kind of like a heroic based deck, but obviously we don't have the heroic mechanic in historic and explorer Pauper. But so very strong card. Very good addition. Well, I don't know if it's a good addition. It's a very strong card for that deck. But I've said that deck is being not very interactive is not the funnest deck to have in the meta. But I think it's an important player, and this might encourage more. I think Ward is a more interactive mechanic than hexproof, and so. I think if this encourages less of the hexproof decks and more of the ward decks, I think it's a little bit more fair. Okay, moving on to break the spell, which is an instant that destroys target enchantment, and then you get slight bonuses in the weird situation where it's permanent you controlled or a token. So basically, the only token enchantments that we have that you could destroy would be the new roll cards. And if it's a permanent you controlled, so if you're killing your own stuff to cycle the cards, so I think you're much better off playing like cards that would sack your permanents instead of and use them in other ways other than just using a card to cycle itself, basically. The only benefit that this gets is you could potentially snipe a roll token from the opponent that's really good for them, or a curse token that they've put on one of your creatures and get some value. But the roll tokens so far have all been bonuses to other cards, and so using a full card to get rid of half of their card, even though this card cycles itself, is probably not good enough, even as a sideboard card. This card, 5 mana. It's only a 3/3 flyer, and then it puts the royal roll token on a different creature, so you have to have another creature in play and get to 5 mana. This is just not playable. The 3 toughness is just so easy to get rid of in Pauper, and it got even more easier with this set, which I'll get to when we cover the black cards. But yeah, so this is not a playable card. This card is really cool. So we got this is the cheapest type of this effect with this ability, exile enchanted creature, but the exile enchanted creature is not part of the cost. So you can play games where you put this on a creature, pay the cost, and then blink the cooped up to a different creature, and then the creature will still be exiled that was originally enchanted on. So it's almost like reality acid deck for historic or explorer Pauper, and this is the cheapest option we've ever gotten for this deck. So there was compulsory rest, I think is what it was called, in Amonkhet, and so you could play with that and this one and try to make a deck around it. It's a little bit of a janky deck. It doesn't quite have the power there of reality acid, but it can kind of do some cute things. It's just kind of a lot of investment on the turn that you do want to blink it, because right now the only blink stuff that you can have access to is starting at 2 mana, so it's a full 5 mana play to kind of reset your aura. But the good part is the front half, like not ignoring that kind of shenanigans with blinking and stuff, the front half is fine. Obviously there's better pacifisms that we could play, but in the deck where this is a relevant bonus, you can kind of still have a reasonable card early and then a synergy card later on. So I think it's one to keep an eye out that it might enable that kind of deck. Frostbridge Guard is a 2 mana 2/2 that taps target creature. Not playable, a little bit too slow. All right, Hopeful Vigil. Very, very strong card. We have already a lot of cards that bounce enchantments and or bounce just permanents back to hand. And so a permanent that its value is in its ETB rather than what it actually, like the actual permanent itself, is super awesome. So basically gives you a 2/2 with Vigilance, which is a fine token to get. But the big bonus is, you get this enchantment in play that you can just bounce for additional 2/2s later in the game. And then you could eventually bargain it away to use it for your bargain. You probably never want to be using this last line unless you're really, really desperate. But a very, very strong card in both Explorer and Historic Pauper. Kellen's Light Blades. We've had a lot of these cards. This one is unique. It is different from all of the other cards that we have, but I just think all of these white cards at 2 mana that punish attacking and blocking are just outmoded forms. You really want ones that either can kill the creature even if it doesn't attack or block, like if it taps or something. Those are much better than one that needs the creature to attack or block. So unfortunately, just this effect is not good enough anymore. Moment of Valor. It's an 3 mana instant that has two modes, which is pretty relevant. It has basically a protection mode where you give your creature a slight buff and make it indestructible, and then it can destroy a big creature. I think these two modes are very flexible. Of note, I think 3 mana is a pretty low bar that we've gotten. Sometimes these effects cost 4 mana. We have had some that only cost 3, but it's pretty rare that we get that cost 3, and this has flexibility of two different modes. We're more and more having a lot of 4 power creatures that are. We have Groff, we have Tolarian Terror, we have Serpentine Curve, and then we have all of the cyclers from LTR in Historic Pauper that are also making waves, and so being able to deal with bigger creatures is actually becoming more and more relevant as the mana values of our decks kind of have gone up since LTR came out. So definitely a consideration. It's probably not going to be ever a 4 of, even though it's a flexible multi-use card. But I think a couple, even because it's flexible, even main deck is reasonable, and definitely a consideration sideboard. Plunge into the Winter, a 2 mana instant that it's basically like Hilflane Knots that was in blue from the last set, where it can tap and it scries, but only scries 1, and then it draws a card. Of note that this one is tap up to 1 target creature, so you could just cycle it, which is also nice. And so basically, a 2 mana scry 1 and draw a card in white is pretty good and an unusual card. So I think this is another pretty reasonable card to have in white decks. Probably not quite what an aggro deck would want, but it's still reasonable in an aggro deck. But really, this is going to shine in more of a control deck to buy a turn and then be able to get a little bit of card filtering. Protective Parents. It's a 3 mana 3/2 creature that has a Undying effect. When it dies, you can attach the hero role token to another creature you can control. I don't think this Protective Parents is playable. I mean, it's definitely playable. I don't think it's a good constructed card. In Historic and Explorer Pauper, there's just much better effects at 3 mana. And this has the same weakness as some of the other cards that we've talked about, where it's you need another creature in play, and then at that point, the opponent either it has a choice: do they allow you to get this value, or do they just kill the other creature and then kill this later on in the game when you don't have another creature in play to give the bonus to? So yeah, unfortunately, not quite there in the constructed realm. Return Triumphant, though, is very relevant. So Return Triumphant is a 2 mana sorcery that returns a creature card 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield, and it puts a young hero role token on the creature. So this is very similar to Recommission. When I first read it, I was like, oh, this looks like Recommission, but slightly worse. But actually, there's a lot of synergy with the whole thing where the toughness is 3 or less. It can keep growing. So there's a lot of cards. There's a thread in our Discord that we talk about all the cards that it looks like it synergizes well with. And so there's a lot of space here where I originally thought that it was just too overlapping with Recommission. You know, it's going to be copies of Recommission 5 through 8, but this definitely has a different space from Recommission. And the fact that it is instead of a counter, it's a enchantment means that you can also play with some bargain cards or other cards that balance permanents that or care about enchantments in play. That this is pretty relevant. So very good card in white. Rhyme for Reindeer, 4 mana 3/4 that whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, you can tap a creature. We also have a lot of flash enchantments, so this is not just an aggro card. This actually can be a pretty relevant as a defensive play, and then to crack back with our flash enchantments that we got from what's that? Was that Theros Beyond Death? this card is reasonable. I don't think it's going to quite get there. I think the initial like 4 mana and then you can start getting its ability is a little bit too slow. Where at 4 mana you can be using the attendant, the 3/4 attendant that bounces a permanent when it enters the battlefield in white, and I think that's a much stronger play than this would be. So I don't think this is quite. It's a good card, but there are better cards at that mana cost in this color that you would play instead of this card. All right, so the next card, Savior of the Sleeping, 3 mana, 2/3 vigilance, and gets a slight bonus when enchantments go to the graveyard. This bonus, there's another card that gets bonuses when enchantments go to the graveyard, and this is not one of them. This is not a good enough card. This is one of those cards, but this is not the playable one. So I don't think you want to be looking to build a deck around this card or play it in Constructed Pauper. A Slumbering Keepguard, a relevant enchantment trigger, and then it can buff itself, and it gets like a pseudo buff similar to Ethereal Armor. I think just this being a 1 mana with no evasion, no other abilities, I guess this is an ability, but before you get to 3 mana, it's not going to really do anything. And generally in these white weenie decks, you don't want to be taking having to spend 3 mana to allow your creature to kind of like trade in combat. Obviously, if it wins in combat, it just doesn't get blocked, and then you can decide to spend or not spend your mana, and so it works out that way. So I think this is a card to keep an eye on, but I don't think it's quite there yet. Again, the 1 toughness, even though you can potentially pump it, generally is just too much of a weakness that I don't think this will see play. On the other hand, we have another very strong card in Stockpiling Celebrant. So this is a similar effect to Core Skyfisher or any sort of bounce effect. So it's we have a lot of permanents and decks based around bouncing permanents. So we have a lot of permanents with relevant ETBs that are useful, and synergy-based decks based around that. So Stockpiling Celebrant is kind of a new mana cost for that kind of effect at 3 mana. So we have 2 at 2 mana, and then we have 2 at 4 mana. And then we have a couple other ones at like artifacts that also do it too. But this one at 3 mana, and it's a pretty good stat line, 3/2, as well as its additional ability. If you do bounce a non-land permanent, then you get to scry 2. It all comes together and makes this a really strong contender for both the enchantment bouncing deck and the artifact bounce deck. The artifact bounce deck, since it's uses like experimental synthesizer and bounces it, this being at 3 mana rather than the other 2 at 2 mana probably makes this a little bit less good. But then in the enchantment deck, it's competing with much higher mana value cards, and so I think that's where this one can potentially see play. The fact that it can trade with the Kami kind of already gives it a consideration in the mirror as well. All right, To Unveil Guide is a 4 mana 2/3 that gets a bonus with Celebration. Unfortunately, a 3 toughness for 4 mana is just too fragile of a stat line that to play it. It's a very strong effect if you trigger Celebration after so it's on like turn 5, you're triggering Celebration. Not the best. But Lifelink on a 3/3 is big game, but just not constructed, and not enough for constructed playability. And the last white card of this set, white common, I should say, Unassuming Sage, a 2 mana 2/2 that has a kicker effect to put a sorcerer role token on your on itself. So it's basically a 2/2 for 2, and then has a kicker of 2 to make it a 4 mana 3/3 that scries when it attacks. Unfortunately, not quite enough. yes, you can sort of use a sorcerer like I've been talking about, all the roll tokens for bargain effects, but you don't want to be paying 4 mana to just be able to get a token that you can sack later on. It's just too much of a mana investment for not enough of a payoff. So very, very strong start to this set. Very strong white cards that are relevant in multiple deck archetypes. Obviously, the enchantment decks get a lot of bonuses because this is an enchantment set, but very, very strong. I'll be moving on to the next color, which is blue.